The car alarm had been screaming for a good 20 minutes or so, and I felt like I was going insane. My son had begun to stir in his sleep, and the last thing I wanted was for him to wake up, and we'd have to go through all of this again. He looks so peaceful. When he's awake, though, he's a freaking handful, far worse than any other 1-year-old. But this is heaven right now, and I'll be danged if I'm going to let a stupid car alarm spoil that. I scooped the little devil up in my arms and moved him to a different bedroom. He began to stir with my awkward movements, which, in turn, made me more awkward. Oh God, please don't wake up. I managed to get him to the next bedroom without him waking. I let out an almost silent but well-deserved exhale. I left the room, slowly closed the door, and finally let my lungs relax. I pressed my right ear flat against the door to double-check I was still good. I was. Just as I was walking down the stairs, the doorbell rang. That freaking doorbell. It was so loud, at least it was to me, that I not only jumped because of the sudden loud chimes, but because it was yet another opportunity for him to wake up. It was my friend, Tina. "Whoa," she said flatly. "I'm sorry, but you look awful, hun." "Geez, thanks, Tina." I pulled the door half closed as to subliminally shut her out. I didn't want her to come in and make any noise. "When was the last time you slept, huh?" I shrugged my shoulders, then wiped my eyes. I honestly couldn't remember. "He's been acting up again, hasn't he? Come on, let me in. You go to bed and I'll take care of—" "No!" No, I'm fine. Honest. I closed the door even more. "Okay, hun. I can tell you're not up for company, so I'll leave you be. But I'll call in a couple hours, okay?" "No! No ringing." The rage that kept trying to explode out of me was getting harder and harder to fight. I just wanted her to leave. She could wake him any moment now. "Okay. No ringing." She shuffled her feet uncomfortably. "I'll check up on you in a few days then." Finally. "That's great. See you then." And just like that, I shut her out. Silence filled my home with an emptiness I had never experienced before. It was almost humming within my ears, humming a song that was equally sinister as it was beautiful. I strained my ears listening out for him. I didn't want to do it again. 30 minutes passed. Nothing. Another 30 minutes. Still nothing. An hour. Zilch. 3 hours. 4 hours. 5. 6. It was roughly around the 12th or 13th hour that I actually finally relaxed. This time, we didn't have to do it again. This time, the medication worked. This all started about 6 years ago, but I figured it was about time for me to share my story. My friends and I had a camping trip planned out at a destination that will remain nameless, but I will refer to as Ocean Lake, as it's a lake so big that upon first seeing it, you'd think it's an ocean. Nearby to this place was a large, mostly unexplored cave system, which not many people knew existed. Me and my friends were raised in this area, and as far as we were aware, we were the first ones to discover this cave system. We dubbed these caves Skull Hollows, as our young creative minds saw the entrance as a giant skull. But when we were older, we saw that it was quite a bit of a stretch to see that. We would frequently visit the caves and explore them, but never bothered to map them. Sometimes we drew up basic maps of the entrance, but we mostly just remembered the caves by memory. I'd honestly long forgotten that the caves even existed until my friends and I were on a camping trip and found a different set of caves which reminded me of all the fun we used to have back in our hometown. So we agreed that our next camping trip would take us back there and we would explore the caves. After a while, that time rolled around and we got ready to go camping out by Ocean Lake. I remember the drive there. It was nice and peaceful. although it was probably the last peaceful day of my life. I watched the trees change shape and size as we neared the location and our environment changed. I got lost in it, and I'm glad that I did. It was no short drive up to Ocean Lake, and getting lost left me to peacefully float through the hours and have them whisked by. But alas, we eventually arrived on the shore of Ocean Lake. God, it had been so many years since I'd seen this place, and for a few minutes, I just stared out admiring it. After that, though, we started unpacking the car. I moved around to the boot and accidentally dropped my keys. I bent over to pick them up and noticed that there was some sort of spider crawling on them. Me, being a tad arachnophobic, jumped a bit before flicking the spider off and continuing on. My friends and I got out all of our camping gear and started hiking to our destination. It was about a 10-mile walk, which should take about 2.5 hours, but given the exceptionally difficult terrain we had to traverse, makes the trip about 5 or 6 hours, meaning by the time we arrived, the sun had set below the hills and it was time to set up camp. Day 1 of 5 down, I said to the group upon arrival at the camping location. Already excited to get home, are ya? Said one of my friends, who I'll call H. Well, it ain't exactly like this is an easy trip, I shot back. Fair enough, H replied, and we got to work setting up the camp. H was my oldest friend by a long shot. We met in kindergarten and have been friends ever since. We'd been there for each other at the hardest times in our lives, and I knew he would never betray me. The third person in our party on the trip was E. She also was one of my oldest friends, and we met in high school. E, H, and I had all been through some pretty intense crap together, and we weren't really even friends at this stage. We were more like family. I'd do anything for them, and I know they'd do anything for me. How far out is it to Skull Hollows from here? E asked us. Since she hadn't been with us for as long, she didn't know the area quite as well, but she was still an expert in navigating the caves themselves. Not far at all. I think it's only a 10 to 15 minute walk down that way, I said, pointing down a path that barely existed anymore. It's just best to camp here instead, so we have access to the lake. Alright, sweet. I assume it's up at the crack of dawn to head out into the hollows? She asked. Wait, why to the crack of dawn? H chimed in. What, are you saying we go in Skull Hollows at night? E almost screamed at H. Why not? Once you're in there, it's all the same. Yeah, except for the fact that there isn't going to be anyone searching at night. E, no one even knows this place exists. No one's going to be searching for us even if there is an emergency. Whatever, I'm still not going in there at night. Hey guys, calm down, E. We will wait until the morning. H, stop being a jerk. I interrupted them as I was sick of their constant bickering. Eventually, we all got settled down and set up our tents. Everything was normal, but I did notice there seemed to be a very high abundance of insects around, but I figured it was probably just the fact that it was an early spring, and all the eggs were hatching. As part of our tradition, we lit a campfire and all sat around it. It honestly felt illegal to not do this. I stared into the flames and watched the coals turn over as the heat split them in two, and saw the flames shoot sparks into the sky as if they were fireworks. H, E, and I all sat around the fire doing relatively little talking. We all lived together and told each other everything, so there was never really much to discuss. But it was always nice to be in each other's company. Eventually the flame burned low, and we all got tired, so we climbed into the tents. As was particularly mandatory for me at this stage, the first night of the camp was a restless one. I got very little sleep, waking up constantly in the night and never getting more than 2 hours of sleep at a time. But I was used to this and just dealt with it. But this time it was slightly different. I noticed the night was strangely quiet. There was meant to be crickets chirping and birds calling, but the night remained almost entirely silent, with the only noise I could hear being the small stream a few hundred meters away. But eventually, I saw through the tent's thin fabric a slight glow on the horizon, and I knew I was finally able to get up. I unzipped the door and raised my body off the ground, inhaling as I did so. I always loved the first morning breath on a camping trip. There was something so freeing about it that it just made me feel amazing. About an hour later, E woke up, then shortly after, H did as well. We all sat down by the fire, which at this stage was nothing more than a pile of ashes, barely smoldering enough to produce a shred of smoke. We all ate our breakfast and talked about what we might do through the day. The obvious answer was to head into Skull Hollows. Since we were all so excited, it was number one on our to-do list while up at Ocean Lake. So after we all finished eating, we got our caving gear ready. When we were kids, our caving gear consisted of a rope, a torch, and that was about it. But now we of course realize how incredibly stupid that was, so we now bring a much more substantial caving pack. Typically we include the following in this: a rope, headlamps, spare batteries, 2 spare torches, food, water, some carabiners, and some other basic climbing equipment. Not really what you should bring into a cave, but we figured it would suffice given a bunch of teenagers used to navigate this cave with just rope and a torch. So, we set off down the trail towards Skull Hollows, and before long we arrived at the entrance. We were actually surprised at how we had managed to remember the route, since it had been almost 10 or 15 years since we had been there. But we all remember the route exactly as if it were yesterday. Upon arriving at the entrance, I wondered how we ever thought this place looked like a skull. The cave had 3 entrances, all close to each other, but one of the entrances was far too small to enter through. The second was just large enough for me and E to fit through, but H was significantly larger than both of us, so he would never fit through it. The final entrance, though, which I can only assume we viewed as the mouth of the skull, was larger and easy for all 3 of us to fit through at the same time. As a basic rule of caving, you should never enter an unfamiliar cave without a rope tethering you to the surface, in case you get lost. But for this cave, having that rope was more of a must. See, the cave descended at an angle of roughly 60 to 70 degrees, so the easiest way down was to upseal into it. Since the caves were in the middle of a forest, we just used a nearby tree as an anchor point and used a makeshift abseiling point. We had specifically made rope for this exact purpose. The rope has knots tied in it at roughly 30 centimeter intervals, so we would strap ourselves in with a makeshift harness and connect 2 carabiners to the rope. We would then simply work our way down the rope by unhooking one carabiner and attaching it on the next section of rope. It wasn't exactly a safe or reliable method, but it did the job. It also allowed for us to simply climb the rope without hooking in if there was an emergency. So, one by one, we all descended the rope, H being first to go down, E second, and I went last. I was about 20 meters to the ground, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you've ever been suspended that far above the ground, you know it is a heck of a long way and always terrifying when you start the descent. I hooked myself in and started to begin the journey. At first it was a slow process, but after a few minutes it was easy to get down into a system of lowering myself. Once we got to the bottom of the cave, we reached what we had known as the mouth, since we reviewed it as the mouth of a skull. Most of the cave we had actually named after body parts since we thought the entrance looked like a skull, but it now meant that I just hated what we called everything, mostly because it just made it all sound gross. Once in the mouth, the other 2 entrances both came down to meet the center. We knew that they didn't go anywhere else since when we were younger and could fit in tighter spots, we had explored them and they just went straight into here. The mouth was a relatively large cavern. It was about 2 meters high and 3 or 4 meters across, leaving plenty of room to comfortably stand and walk around. At this stage, the cave didn't really hold much to take note of. We knew that it was a common occurrence for animals to rest in here. Foxes in specific, we had found on many occasions resting in large groups during the winter. Coming back to it and thinking of large groups of foxes nesting in a cave was quite unusual, but when we were younger we never thought anything of it. The walls of the mouth were made up of some sort of smooth rock with many grooves going in and out of them. While in the mouth, the three of us took a moment to absorb the nostalgia of being in here. H and I probably spent at least 6 months of our life in these caves, and being here brought back so many memories. E didn't have quite as many as us, but she still had plenty of her own. We spent a while in this cavern just talking about it and reminiscing of our childhood years. We found some old cave paintings that we had made. We tried to make it out so that it looked like we were cavemen thousands of years ago who could predict the future, and he was drawn representations of all the major events we could think of. And then, of course, at the very end, we all put aliens invading the Earth in the hopes that one day historians would find it and think that the world was going to be destroyed by aliens. This old memory made me laugh, thinking of how naive we used to be. But eventually came to the stage to move into the next part of the cave, where the cave split into 3 pathways. The first was a large opening that just led around a corner before shrinking down into nothing. The second was a much smaller entrance, so the caver would have to be on their knees to access it. And the third was in between the two. We decided that we should head into the third path first. I had the luxury of going in first since I was the smallest of us, and if it was too small for me to go, it would be too small for E or H to get through. The opening to the pathway was decently sized and one could crouch through it, but the tunnel quickly tightened to the point where you have to crawl through. But this was only a few feet before the cave opened up again. Once you make it through the small tunnel, you would have to stand fully upright and shift your body to be parallel with the cave walls and wiggle in between the walls, which for me was fairly easy, but I knew E and H may struggle a bit when getting through here. And then, once you have finally gotten through this stage, the cave will open up into a second cavern, which we had dubbed the East Lung. We didn't actually know if it was east or not, but we simply referred to it as such. We called it this because the cavern had probably 100 tiny offshoots into random directions. 90% of these were far too small for a person to fit through, but there were a few of the offshoots that a person could get into if they were to go on their stomach, but out of all, only 2 actually led somewhere. Once in here, I stood up and again took a moment to reminisce over it while waiting for E and H to get through. When they finally got through, I noticed H had a scratch on his head. It wasn't very big, and nothing he wasn't used to, but still rather big. We aren't even 50 meters into the cave and you already scratched yourself? It wasn't my fault, H replied with a tad of annoyance in his voice. This one here, he gestured to E, thought it would be funny to hide around a corner and jump out and scare me. I saw E giggle silently as H was telling this and I couldn't help but join in. I'm sorry, but I saw the chance to and I just couldn't resist, E said chuckling. Well, now I have a hole in my head. Are you happy now? Yes, very happy. I heard H sigh. Things like this were very common, and H said he hated E for it, but we all knew he loved her for it. After a while of nostalgia through the caves, we continued on, venturing deeper into the system. We explored every single nook and cranny we possibly could, until we got to one of the last ones. It was probably the highest fit in the cave, and while I was pretty certain E and I could fit through, I knew H wouldn't be able to without losing a lot of skin. So H agreed to stay back and wait until we had gone through it. This section of the cave was just barely bigger than my body, and was a claustrophobe's nightmare. To enter this tunnel, you would have to place your hands in front of your body and gently wiggle through, using your toes to slowly push your body forwards. I, being the smallest, was once again first to enter. I first got into my stomach and pointed my arms into the hole, then began to inch my way forwards. To fit, I had to turn my head to the side and leave it laying on the ground, which meant it was cold. I noted the stone was unusually warm when it normally would have felt like lying against a tile floor. I began to slide my body forwards through the passage, scraping my cheek slightly while doing so. I pushed myself further and further into the cave, and with each shove, I felt the cave tighten around my body. I felt the warm stone press on every inch of my body as I wiggled further forwards, but the cave still tightened. After a few minutes of this, I had to take a break to catch my breath. Being in this position is an incredibly surreal one. It's such a tight position that it feels as though you're frozen still and you've become one with the cave. There are thousands of kilometers of dirt beneath you and a mountain on top of you. If a single rock fell, you would become part of the earth. It would be a quick, painless death, but your body would not be as lucky. Your flesh would slowly break down into dust as your bones turned into stone. And it's possible that in millions of years from now, the earth might have shifted enough to the point where someone of another race would find your fossilized skeleton and discover the mystery of your death. It would be a grim way to go. After finishing this dark thought, I got moving again, and after a few more minutes, I was out on the other side of the passage. The other side wasn't a massive cavern, but it held enough room for a few people to crouch down in. I used this as a chance to rest while I waited for E to come through. As I was doing so, I noticed something strange. There was a line of ants. They were walking from a small hole in one side of the cavern out over to the other side and disappearing into the wall. Seeing ants down here was an incredibly weird sight. There shouldn't be anything alive down here, but somehow ants were. I waited for E to pull through and asked her what she thought of it. She said it was probably just some type of unknown subterranean ant, and moved past it at that. But I wasn't quite as content with that, and decided that on the way out I'd try and take a few of the ants home. Once through this small passage, the caver was granted a small amount of space, enough to comfortably stand up and walk around in. Probably about 1 to 2 meters across in length and width before the cave quickly shrunk again into the smallest passage in the entire system. It took me a few minutes to compose myself before I got ready to enter it. To enter through here, you had the option of going either head first or feet first. The passage went downwards on a relatively steep slope and then opened up to a large flat cavern at the bottom. It was roughly 6 meters in the passage from the top to bottom. I decided that I would enter head first, because why not? I got down on my belly and put my arms in front of my head and slithered into the passage. Instantly, I felt the dirt around me. It was still oddly and disturbingly warm. This combined with the ants from before, I was on edge, but I decided to continue further into the passage. The dirt was hugging me all around. The disturbingly warm dirt, it was on every single side of my body, touching me as if it were alive and trying to keep me in place. I pushed further down, and further, inching my way centimeter by centimeter, getting deeper into the passage. This was the tightest hole I'd ever been in. I could feel the pressure of the hot dirt on every side of me. It all pushed me down further into the passage. And then I realized I wasn't pushing myself down into the passage. The dirt was. I tried looking around to see what was going on, but I couldn't move my head at all, and I was being forced deeper and deeper. I tried calling out to E, but it was useless. My body was blocking the entire passage back, and no sound could make it through. At this stage, I was horrified, screaming my lungs out and trying everything I could to push myself back on the slope, but nothing worked. I could barely move. In the midst of all my struggling, I barely noticed it, but I felt on my head something crawling, like an insect or a spider, crawling through my hair up towards my headlight. And then whatever creature it was turned it off and pushed it down the slope. Now I was left in the dark and trapped in place by dirt that was forcing me down. I still tried and called out to E through my tears of dread. E, please, if you can hear me, help, please. But I never got anything in response. The walls forced me deeper into the passage, and then I realized something that made the situation far more horrifying. It wasn't the dirt pushing me down. I could feel thousands of tiny legs on me, thousands of tiny little bodies surrounding me on every side, all pushing me down. Tiny insects were wandering my body, forcing me down into the depths of the cave. They were forcing me through the walls and dragging my flesh against the ragged edges of the cave, leaving blood behind. They pushed me as far as they could until the cave got too small for me to travel further. They seemed to scatter at this stage. I could just faintly hear the footsteps of the insects running away. Other than that, all I could hear was my own breathing. I sat in this position for hours. I was frozen in place, unable to do anything. I tried forcing myself upwards, but nothing happened. The most I could do was wiggle my fingers, but of course that wasn't going to help much. I tried calling out to E, but she still didn't respond. I figured something must have happened to her as well, otherwise she would have figured out something. I was stuck in that tomb for hours before eventually I heard more tiny sounds of insects walking towards me in the dark. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel their warmth return and the tiniest sound emanate from them. I felt a spider walk up my face to my eye. It seemed to be trying to walk all over me. It felt every part of my face, its long, tiny, hairy limbs gracing every inch of my skin until it found my mouth, to which it slowly walked over to. Once there, it took its spindle arms and put them between my lips. It shoved its legs in and forced my mouth open. I tried to bite down on it to kill it, but it had some sort of exoskeleton and was unfazed by my attempts to struggle as it continued to force its way in. Eventually, it got inside my mouth and sat on my tongue. I could feel it moving around inside me, and then it decided to descend further. It began to walk to the back of my mouth where it forced its way down. I could feel it force down my windpipe as it opened and then crawled into one of my lungs. I felt it get deeper inside my lung until it stopped. I could feel it wriggling and writhing inside my lung. I felt pain of what I could only assume was it puncturing my lung from the inside as it rearranged my insides until eventually it began its way back out of my body. It crawled back through my windpipe and out of my mouth. This was followed by more insects doing the exact same. Next, I felt another creature approach my face. I felt 1,000 tiny legs attached to a long body, all in a neat row, scatter across my cheek. It was so disturbingly and unnaturally warm, almost to the point where it burnt my face as it crawled across. Its long, needle-like legs pricked my skin as they surveyed every inch of my face. The tiny legs had my face in their grasp as they dug deeper into my skin. I felt a small trickle of blood come from each hole as they made. The blood dripped into my mouth and I could taste it. It had an oddly and terrifyingly bitter taste to it, and the texture was like wax. I tried to spit it out, but my body wouldn't let me. Eventually, the creature, which I can only assume was a centipede, located my mouth and did what I dreaded most. Like the spider beforehand, it pried my lips open, this time tearing out chunks of flesh as it did so. And as I felt the horrid thing caress my tongue, I tasted the most horrible sour thing I had ever tasted. It was like rotting flesh and death. I tried my hardest to spit it out, but the thing didn't even notice me trying. It moved to the back of my throat, the creature so long that even with its head at the back of my throat forcing my windpipe open, its tail still sat inside my mouth. Then it began to descend further, the body of the monstrosity in my lungs and its tail on my tongue, as it slowly brought its tail too. It felt like it was destroying my lungs, trying to fit its body inside of them, and it squirmed and slithered around inside me until it decided to emerge. But as it did, something far worse happened. I felt another one, on my cheek. It walked its way to my ear, where it made a new hole and dug through my bone and muscles into my throat. As more entered through my nose and mouth, I had what felt like hundreds forcing their way inside of me, all in the aim to reach my lungs. I felt insects of every type do this, entire colonies of ants digging through my cheeks or directly through my chest into my lungs, and doing something to them, but I didn't quite know what. There were crickets, bees, spiders, scorpions. Any nightmarish bug you could think of forced its way inside of my lungs, some through my mouth, others carving their way through my chest or back, and some through any other hole. I didn't know how many times this happened, but I do know that by the end of it, I could feel my body on the verge of death. I'd heard stories that when trapped in places like this, time travels faster than what you think, so I may have been in there for days. And just as I was ready to give up and pass into the next life, I felt something. My body was suddenly being pulled backwards. At first, I was excited. Someone had come to rescue me. But I realized that once again, it was the walls, or actually the insects, moving me back up the slope. They pushed me upwards through the passage to the surface, and once there, they delivered me my headlamp. I turned it on and looked around to see if E was nearby, and to my horror, she was. I saw her at the other end of the small cavern. She was pinned against the wall. I saw spiders and centipedes crawling all over her body. I saw them enter and exit every hole they could, even crawling through her eyes and out of her ears. I ran over to her and checked for a pulse. I wasn't hopeful, and what I already knew was confirmed. She'd been dead a while. Her hand was cold to the touch. I took a moment to pause before I went on my way out. That's when I realized why I at first thought the walls were moving me down. They were. I looked closely at the walls and saw the most horrifying thing I had ever witnessed. The walls were alive, made of thousands of tiny organisms, all staying together to create the illusion of a cave wall. I vomited at the sight of this onto the floor that I now realized was made of life as well. I decided that I had to get out and began to run. I crawled as fast as I possibly could, now noticing every single little insect I touched. I felt their tiny, horrid legs, but through some blessing they left me alone. I could tell they were watching me, but I just crawled through and ran when I could. I eventually made it to the first cavern on the cave before the entrance. I hadn't encountered H on the way, so I figured he must have already left. Thankfully, the rope was still there. I didn't bother to clip myself in, I just grabbed the rope and ascended as fast as I possibly could. Once I reached the surface, I looked around but still had no sign of H. I took a moment to rest. I was covered in blood and scratches from exiting the cave so fast. I still had tears in my eyes and was so exhausted I could barely move. But I managed to stand up and walk to the campsite. There was nothing there. It was empty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. So I started back towards the road where we had parked. I don't know how I had the strength to get through, but a full day later I arrived at the car park. That's where I saw the car that we had driven up in wasn't there. But another was, and in it I saw a man, so I just ran over to him and asked for help. He was shocked and terrified by the sight of me, but he could tell that I was just a camper on the verge of death. He did his best to help me. There wasn't a whole lot he could do, but he did his best and called an ambulance. Once it arrived, they drove me as fast as they could to the nearest hospital. According to them, I fell asleep along the way and slipped into a coma. I was out for a week, but I woke up eventually with H by my side. "Hey buddy," he said. "Hey," I replied as I entered a small coughing fit. "I gotta say, I never would have thought I'd see you again." "Yeah, I didn't think I'd made it out of there either." "Wait, were you in the cave this whole time?" he asked with a sense of horror in his voice. "Yeah, where else would I have been?" "I don't know, in the woods lost? How did you survive down there for that long?" I could feel the fear and confusion in his voice. What do you mean? It's only been a few days, hasn't it? It's been 3 years. What? No, you're joking, right? I said in a panic. I wouldn't joke about that, he said and showed me his phone with the date on it. See? It's been 3 years since you and E got lost in the caves. I assume E didn't make it? Yeah, I found her dead. Did you realize what the cave actually was? I asked, trying to make sense of this. No. What do you mean? From what the authorities could figure out, you and E just got lost in the caves and could never make it out. What do you mean what the cave actually was? Nothing. It was probably just my brain going insane since I was in there for 3 years apparently. H had about 1,000 more questions as I did. I have no idea how I survived there for 3 years. It felt like at most a few days, but 3 whole years? It felt impossible, but there was nothing I could do except just try and return to my life. I did my best to pick up where I left off, but that wasn't exactly easy. I tried to bury the memories of the cave and forget about it, but it was all there at the back of my mind, and it haunted me every day. Thankfully, the media never got a hold of it though, so not many people knew that I had been in a cave for 3 years, and those who knew the truth helped me convince everyone else that I was just getting lost in the woods, and that's where I was. And slowly, my life returned to normality, or some sense of it, until last night. I was sitting at my desk doing some work when I felt a strong cough come on, and it felt like I was going to cough up my lung, but instead it was something far, far worse. A small egg flew out of my mouth, and from it a spider hatched, and it ran away. I remembered the creatures from the cave all too well, and I know that they are nothing of this world, and I know that there is more to come. I was on my 8th headache of the week when my boss finally made me make a doctor's appointment. I'm a reporter, so the majority of my work is done on the computer, and it makes sense that my eyes might get a little strained. I was nervous in the waiting room. 1, because it was a new place, Castle Optometry, the southern quarter of Habitsville, and 2, because it had been an embarrassingly long time since I had been in. I'm terrible about keeping up with appointments, and apparently so is everyone else in Habitsville, seeing as it was a Monday morning and the waiting room was completely empty. That being said, the office seemed pleasant, clean, non-threatening. I know that may be a strange quality to search for in an optometrist office, but you haven't seen the things that I have. There were framed paintings around, idyllic scenes of the countryside, goats in a pasture, an apple tree. None of the weird eye diagrams you see in most places. Something about the small town quaintness seemed to ease my nerves, and I wondered if they did that on purpose. Singer? That was me. A man stood in the doorway to the exam rooms, smiling at me with the normal white-toothed grin of most doctors. He looked to be in his 40s, with lightly tanned skin and an inconspicuously receding hairline. If you Googled doctor, this is probably the guy that would show up, with the white lab coat and everything. "Hello, Samuel," he said after checking his chart. "I'm Dr. Castle. How are we doing today?" He asked me as he led me farther into the other side of the building. It was strange. I had assumed that there would be at least one other person there, besides the 2 of us. But all that we passed by were darkened exam rooms after darkened exam rooms. The only sound was the air conditioner and our 2 sets of footsteps against the linoleum tile. "Good," I answered. "Glad to hear it. Mondays, am I right?" He laughed a clearly fake laugh, and I gave a weak chuckle in response. We finally came across the room he was looking for. "After you," he said, motioning with his clipboard to the dim doorway. I stepped into the blackness, feeling an increased amount of wariness that I knew was silly. Then he stepped in behind me, flipped on the light, and closed the door. "Take a seat," he said, and I sat in the chair positioned in front of a blank white wall. "What seems to be the problem?" "Headaches," I replied. "Just about every day. I work in front of a computer, so—" "Gotcha," he answered, scribbling on his clipboard. I watched him idly, the way his hand jotted across the paper in that classic Dr. Chicken Scratch. And then I blinked. There was a moment, as my eyes drifted past the pen and the clipboard, that I saw something on his chest. An odd bit of movement. Not breathing. It wasn't nearly so measured and smooth. It was as though a bird had given a single flap of its wing underneath the fabric over his sternum. I rubbed my eyes, blinked again, but I didn't see the movement after that. I figured it was just a trick of the light, or just more proof that I probably needed glasses. "That blue light can really put stress on the eyes," Dr. Castle continued before clicking his pen closed. "Let's go ahead and get you started with something easy, the eye chart." He turned down the lights, flipped on the switch, and suddenly there was something projected on the blank expanse of the wall in front of me. The familiar block letters I probably hadn't seen since I was in elementary school. "Go ahead and read the first line." "E." "Good. And the second?" "Y-E." "Wonderful. And the third?" "S-H-E." There was a pause this time. He cleared his throat. "Mm-hmm. And the fourth?" "N-E-E-D." An even longer quiet. I stole a glance over at the doctor, and he was staring down at his clipboard, his pen frozen on the paper. I could see his nostrils flaring with every breath, a vein in his temple standing out disturbingly far. "Dr. Castle, are you—" I began to ask. "The fifth line, Samuel." Whatever came over him seemed to fade a bit, and he looked up at me with a smile. I uneasily turned back to the chart. P-L-E-A-S-E. I jumped in my chair as Dr. Castle slammed his clipboard down onto the desk in the corner of the room. His breathing was heavy, and he flipped the lights back on without warning, causing me to wince. There was a moment, before my eyes had adjusted to the sudden exposure, when Dr. Castle turned back towards me, and I saw it again. That same fluttering movement beneath his shirt directly in the center. I rubbed my eyes, black spots dancing in front of them, but just like before, once my eyes refocused, I couldn't see the movement again. "No sense in reading more, eh? Seems like you got far enough," the doctor said hurriedly, his face flushed and agitated. He grabbed a tool, a strange baton with a flat black disc on the end. "Time for the cover test. Have you done this before?" "Not that I can remember," I answered. There was a feeling of unease in the pit of my stomach. I considered faking some sort of excuse and finding a reason to leave, but he was already rolling a stool in front of my chair, the piece of equipment held aloft. "It's simple," he said with a smile that didn't distract from the fact that his eyes were now slightly bloodshot. "I'll hold this over one of your eyes, and you just look straight ahead. It's just to make sure that each of your eyes are aligned properly. Easy peasy." I nodded. "Right eye first," he said, before placing the device over my eye. "Go ahead and keep the covered one open and look forward as best you can." My right eye was shrouded in darkness, and for a moment all I saw was the face of Dr. Castle, as he gazed intently into my own. And then, quite suddenly, I jumped back. An icy chill crept down my spine and a sweat broke out across my forehead. I felt sick. Dr. Castle looked a bit taken aback. "Are you okay, Samuel?" "Yeah," I answered breathlessly, though I was nothing of the sort. I almost told Dr. Castle what I had seen, there in the darkness behind the shield of his equipment, but I thought better of it. Of course, it hadn't really been there. My anxieties over the appointment were just manifesting into something strange. That was all. Dr. Castle was peering at me now with a peculiar expression, one that I couldn't quite place. It was as though we were both on the cusp of saying something truly bizarre, yet neither of us wanted to give in without the other doing so first. "I'm sorry," I said, clearing my throat and readjusting my seat. "I just got a little bit dizzy." Dr. Castle let out a quiet sigh of relief, but the tension I sensed within him hardly ebbed. He rolled his stool closer and held out the blinder. "No worries," he said casually. "Let's try that again." I took a deep breath and tried to relax. He pressed the cool plastic over my right eye. The darkness covered half of my sight, and then... shh. I leapt back again. There was no denying it that time. There had been a girl. She had been standing against the blackness like it was in a room, one spot of paleness amongst the void. She was wearing a dress, neat and gray. Her hair was in braids, not mussed or dirty. She had those frilly socks with the little collars, and the polished shoes that buckled. Her hand was held to her face, one short, plump finger extended up and pressed against her lips, directly below something that made my hair stand on end. A single eye, of monstrous size, glistened with vicious wetness and framed by huge, fibrous lashes in the very center of her face. She blinked one slow blink, and terrifyingly, I could hear the squelch as each eyelid moved to meet the other. That was when I had pulled away and sat doubled over on my chair, only slightly conscious of the look that my optometrist was giving me. I had no words to explain to him for my actions. There was no way I could tell him what I had seen. But I didn't have to. It was her, wasn't it? My head shot in his direction, and I could see him, ashen and grave on his seat. He wasn't looking back at me, only gazing down at the shield he had used, as though picturing the girl with the small black oval. You've seen her too?" I asked breathlessly. I was glad that he knew what had happened without me having to say it, but there was something else there too, a cold, dreadful recognition on his face. He pinched the bridge of his nose with his fingers for a moment, then quickly got up from his chair. "I'm sorry, Samuel," he said in a low voice. The bright demeanor that he had when I first entered the office was gone. "Sorry about what?" I asked. There was a pause. My heart was beating fast and hard in my chest. One bead of sweat rolled down my temple as the pit of anxiety and fear in my stomach billowed up to my throat. And then he smiled, a tense, strange smile. "Sorry this appointment is taking so long. Luckily, there's just one test left." Before I could process the sudden change in tone, he had wrapped a hand tight around my forearm, much too tight. "Wait," I half said, but I was already being swung to the other side of the room and tossed into the reclined examination chair there. My immediate instinct was to get up, to leave the room and the Castle Optometry office altogether, but that plan was cut off with the same force that my air was, as a thick metal band suddenly clamped around my windpipe. I gasped and pulled at it, but my fingers clawed uselessly against the cold steel. I lay there, wheezing, as Dr. Castle rolled over the machine. "Now this is called a phoropter, Samuel," Dr. Castle said with an eerie calm in his voice. He placed it in front of my face, and I tried to pull away, but the band around my throat kept me locked in place. "All you have to do is look through it and tell me when you can see the image the clearest." "Please, stop," I tried to say, but the air it took to form even the single word was too much and sent me gasping. The oxygen deprivation was making my head spin, and I didn't have the strength to fight as the binocular-like limb of the machine was pressed over my eyes. At first, I didn't see anything. "How's this?" Dr. Castle drifted, his voice steady. I tried my best to shake my head, knowing that the edge of the metal against the soft of my neck was going to leave bruises. The man said. Then I heard a switch. "How about this?" A spasm of fear rippled through me as I pulled against my bonds. I was coughing violently, my eyes watering, but I could still see the shape in front of me. It was completely dark, a flat, black spaciousness unlike anything I'd ever seen. And there she was, standing in the center. The same pale translucence and neat appearance, same shine to her shoes, same hair and braids tied with ribbons at the ends. She was standing far away, her hands clasped behind her back as though waiting. The same single blue eye in the center of her head, staring back at me. "Still not clear enough?" I heard Dr. Castle ask, somewhere to my right. "How's this?" Another switch and I lurched again, my head swimming from the pressure in my trachea, kept conscious only by the intense terror I was feeling. With whatever adjustment Dr. Castle had made on the phoropter, the girl had moved closer. She stood only a few feet away now. I could see her eye water, could hear the wet sound of the blink so clearly it made my stomach turn. She tilted slightly on her heels, back and forth, like an antsy child about to ask for a favor. "Please," I hacked again, the only word that could escape my lips, one of desperation. The blood was now tight in my head, and my ears rang with the pressure. I wondered what would get me first, the slow, aching strangulation, or whatever the girl would do to me once she got close enough. "One more, you think?" I heard Dr. Castle call from the room outside of the void. I tried to say no, to scream into the empty office, something, but no sound came out. Click. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for some unknown terror to take hold of me. But nothing happened. I opened my eyes, and there was nothing before me, a flat expanse of black, completely empty. The girl and the globous orb that was her eye were gone. The machine was pulled away from my face, and soon the image of the office replaced it. My pulse was strained, my vision cloudy, and though it seemed the ordeal with the girl was over, the tightness around my throat didn't lessen. I half raised an arm to my neck, and out of the corner of my eye I could see Dr. Castle shake his head with pity. "Sorry, Samuel, your test isn't quite over," he sighed. "I had hoped that it wouldn't come to this, that I had given enough, but I'm afraid sacrifices have to be made." I didn't understand what he meant, and I didn't have the energy to ask any of the questions that were racing through my mind. Then Dr. Castle reached over and gently held my chin with his fingers. With an almost tender push, he let my head fall to the left. There she was. Standing in the corner of the room, as still as could be, was the girl. She was pale, mottled flesh, no longer a nightmare vision in the blackened box of the eye exam. And her eye, it glistened under the fluorescence with a sickening sheen. I could see every eyelash down to the follicle, could see the pink edges touch ever so slightly in the center as she blinked. And then she brought her hands out from behind her back, and what little breath I had stopped dead. Her left hand was empty, but in her right was another, an identical little girl in an identical dress with identical braids, holding hands with the girl I had seen twice prior, tiny fingers intertwined. The only difference? Instead of a huge glistening eye in the center of the second girl's face, there was only a gaping hole. It was red and raw, purple around the edges where it blended into her sickly skin, the largest open wound I had ever seen. They walked towards me slowly, hand in hand. I stared back at them weakly as the one with sight led the other. She stood in front of me, her face close to mine. No breath seemed to flow from her slightly open mouth. I could see each vein in the white's eyes, the liquid of her iris jiggling as she moved. She tilted her head to the side, as though she were curious about something. Then, she reached out a finger and gently touched my face. Her cold cement skin felt wrong against mine. and I made a gurgle of protest as she put a finger to each of my eyelids. She spread them wide, peering inside. Then she turned and looked back at the other girl, then back at the eye. And then, as the horrific child stared deeply into my exposed cornea, I realized what was happening. It was a fitting. I still don't know how I understood them, the mannerisms of this otherworldly child in front of me, but I could see it was a calculation taking place in her mind, an effort she was making to find a replacement for the eye that was taken from the other, a way to give her sight once more. I was weak then, unconsciousness seeping into my frame of vision, around the edges like a vignette in a photograph. The urge to simply drift into the blackness was powerful, especially if it meant I was going to miss whatever would surely take place soon. Then, the girl's fingertips slipped past the eyelid painfully and tried to get a grip on my eyeball itself. That was what did it. That action, so disturbing and alien, sparked the last bit of adrenaline in my body to flow into my veins. I raised my arms and brought them down as hard as I could, flailing wildly. The girls both backed away from me as I gasped and struggled. "Let me go," I hissed through clenched teeth. I could feel blood prick from my neck as the metal ground against my skin as I shook violently, a last-ditch effort to free myself. But soon I felt a hand on my arm, and I turned my head. There was Dr. Castle, holding my arm in place. "Samuel, you need to let them take it. It's the only thing that will keep them away, at least for a little while." I stared at this man, his desperate expression, the way his knuckles shone with white with how tightly he was holding my arm. Like whatever these girls were doing, he needed it to happen, for his own sake. And then I saw it again, that quick bird-wing flutter movement below the fabric of his shirt in the very center of his chest. I waited a second more, then let the effort in my arm ebb. I let my head fall limply against my shoulder, my eyes fall close, my breathing slow, then stop. The doctor paused a moment, then I felt his hands leave my arm. "Go ahead," I heard him tell the girl. After a second, I felt the cold tingle of her fingertips brush my eyelid. That was when my eyes flashed open. I picked my arm up one last time, clawed outward until I felt the fabric. Then I pulled with all my might, every ounce of strength that I had left. Then I heard a rip and the clinking sound of a few buttons hitting the floor. There was dead silence. Dr. Castle stood frozen next to my head, though he wasn't looking at me. Instead, he stared at the girl, whose wide blue eye was fixed on him, its expression wide and surprised. There, embedded in the center of Dr. Castle's chest like a stone set in a ring, was a monstrous blue eye. It blinked, only once. I couldn't see what happened, because once the girl lunged forward and pushed Dr. Castle to the ground, they were beyond my field of vision. Instead, I stared at the other girl, with a gaping hole in her head, as we both listened to the grunts and screams and scuffling of the two on the floor. There was a guttural yell, a sound like a cork being pulled from a bottle, and then silence. The other girl walked back into my vision, scraped with claw marks and splattered with blood. In her hands, like a basketball, reddened around one edge by a long scratch, was the other eye. She held the blind girl's hand and squeezed. Then, with a push, the other eye popped into the other girl's head. There was a moment where it spun slightly as though she wasn't in control of it. Then it settled, and soon, both girls were staring at me. I was too tired to feel fear any longer. They both blinked, and they were gone. There was another click in the stillness of the exam room, the band of metal releasing from my throat. I choked and coughed a bit, and once I could breathe, I was able to sit up in the chair. I made my way out of the room, out of the Castle Optometry office. careful not to look at what was left of the doctor as I went. Hey friends, thanks for joining me today for Horror Time Story Time. I apologize, I've kind of been MIA for the last week. It was actually my birthday on Sunday, May 2nd, so I just kind of took the week off to chill out and celebrate my birthday with my husband and my family. So I want to thank you guys for your patience, and don't worry, my upload schedule will remain the same, so Wednesday and Fridays expect some Horror Time Story Time videos. I may throw in a regular nail video here and there, but my main focus is now going to be on the Horror Time Story Time, just because I enjoy it a lot and I think it's super fun. So if you guys have any stories that you would like me to read that are your own, or maybe it's just when you came across that the author is okay with me reading it, go ahead and send that over to me at risenernails@outlook.com. I'll put that email address in the link below, just so you guys can see it there. As always, thanks for joining me. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye guys.